Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little, and today I'm excited to tell you about my next webinar for the Excelling at No Limit Hold'em webinar series titled How to Think About Hand Ranges. Quite often you will hear players be annoyed or aggravated because they do not put their opponents on the proper range. And it's really not as simple as just getting good at putting good players on hand ranges. You also have to figure out how your exact opponent thinks. And quite often, an amateur player will be thinking very different things compared to a world-class professional. And in this webinar, I'm going to be reviewing 25 hands where I go through hands that beginners play, amateurs play, decent players, strong players, and then finally, excellent players. But today, I want to share with you one hand played against an amateur that I thought was somewhat enlightening. And then we're going to compare it to how you should play this hand against a good player. So, the blinds are 100, 200. We have 20,000 chips, which is 100 big blinds. A straightforward guy raises from third position, and I have pocket fours. This seems like a pretty easy spot to call and see what develops. We're mainly just hoping to flop a set. And the big blind calls, so we see the flop three ways. Flop comes ace, king, four, giving us a set. And this is a scenario where when the straightforward guy bets 1,000 into the 1,600 chip pot, a lot of players just blindly raise and think, yeah, I have a set, I raise. I need to be raising this because it's the top of my range. And while there certainly is some merit to this, you have to ask yourself, if you raise, what will your opponent think your range is? And if your opponent's going to think your range is exactly premium hands, raising is a disaster. But we are against an amateur player, and amateur players typically aren't thinking that. They're just thinking, oh, I have top pair. Top pair is great. I'm not folding that. And that's the end of the thought process. And it's important to actually recognize that. So this is a spot against an amateur where I think you should certainly raise. But if we were playing against a very good player, I would strongly recommend you call, because what hands are you actually raising in this spot for value? You probably don't have aces or kings, and if you did, you wouldn't want to raise them anyway because it's really hard for your opponent to have anything if you have pocket aces. You could have pocket fours, which would make sense to raise, and then maybe ace four suited, but that's about it, right? I mean, typically you'd 3-bet ace king preflop, so your raising range for value is only pocket fours. So that means you need to throw in some bluffs, and hands like queen jack and jack 10 would be fine to bluff with, but you have to realize that if you're only raising the spot very, very rarely, your opponent can just fold a lot of the time, and that will allow them to get off the hook. And you'll find that a lot of amateur players in this spot would raise with the pocket fours, but that would be it. They would not raise with any other value hands. And that's a pretty big disaster, because when you do raise, it should be somewhat obvious to your opponent that you do have a very good hand. So the way you would balance this is by either raising wider, but I don't really think you want to raise hands like ace queen and ace jack, because then if your opponent continues, you're still often in marginal shape given you raise from early position. So I think the easiest way to balance this spot is just call with everything. That's going to put your opponent in a pretty tough spot going to most turns, and it's going to really disguise your hand strength. But again, we're not playing against a good player. We're playing against an amateur. And against amateurs, just play your hand somewhat straightforward. That's all you really have to do. So I raised to 2,900. He calls, and now we're just going for pure value. I do recognize sometimes my opponent will have me beat with aces or kings, but if he does, that's fine. We're getting stacked. You're not trying to avoid super setups. Turn I bet 4,300 into 7,400. My opponent calls, and at this point, I think he has ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, something like that, pretty much every time. And on the river, he checks. And this is kind of an interesting spot, too, in a tournament setting where I'm not sure all opponents will call an all-in bet. So I think a bet of maybe 7,500 would be pretty sweet if we think our opponent may have a hand like ace, queen, ace, jack, ace 10, and then we'll fold it to a river all in. And I don't know if that's going to be the case against the specific opponent, but against a lot of amateurs, they do not want to go broke. And it's worth recognizing that. A lot of professionals are much more inclined to call if you bet all in a spot where any bet that you make is going to be very significant anyway, because they are not so opposed to going broke. Whereas a lot of amateurs, especially early in a tournament, and I imagine this hand was from early in a tournament, they're not trying to fly across the world to buy into a tournament and then bust on the third hand of the day. That's just not what they're trying to do. So against a lot of amateurs here, I will make a smaller bet. I do go for the all-in this scenario, and I think it's fine, but just be aware that that is a consideration that you can make. If the pot was perhaps a little bit smaller, I would have likely not gone all in. But I did shove in that spot, and we ended up stacking the opponent. But it is worth mentioning that that is not how I would play the hand against a professional. And you need to think about your opponent's hand range and what they're going to think that you have. And typically the amateur is not going to think about much, and the professional is going to be thinking about a lot. And a lot of pros just realize you cannot have a very big value range there, and you're probably also not going to bluff there because your opponent could easily just have ace king and just never ever fold. So anyway, we're going to be going through 25 examples similar to this in the How to Think About Hand Ranges webinar on Saturday, December 19th from noon until 3 p.m. Eastern time. Make sure you are on the right time zone whenever we do the webinar. And in this webinar, I will explain how various player types think about hand ranges. And I'll also review 25 hands versus these various player types. You can sign up for this webinar at holdembook.com/handranges, or you can just click the buttons below this video. That will take you right there. Be sure to sign up. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. This is the first exclusive webinar in the Excelling at No Limit Hold'em series, and I am very confident that this webinar series is going to be an amazing learning experience for anyone who wants to get good at poker. So be sure to sign up, and I will see you there.